Okay, ladies and gentlemen. So, after that, we'll reset slightly. We're now going to focus on the question of the delivery gap. How do we meet citizens' expectations, and what should governments be doing about that? So it's a big topic. It follows from what we were talking about yesterday in terms of the gaps in the economy and the gaps in politics. But we're getting down to some of the practical questions about the delivery of public services by governments and the expectations that citizens have. And I think there's two parts to that, clearly. On the one hand, there's the actual activity of government, and how is that organised, how is that monitored, measured, and how does it ultimately deliver? And what can we learn from around the world about how that can be improved? But importantly, the other part is, of course, citizens' expectations. How are they set? How are they framed? How are they communicated to government? And how does government listen to those expectations? And I'm quite sure that the distinguished panel we have here are going to help illuminate those questions for us. I'm very briefly going to introduce them. As you know, their biographies are in your pack, so you can find out more about the background of our speakers there. But to my left, David Fine from McKinsey. Beyond David, Leany Barreiro de Sousa Lemos. Apologies for doing great injustice to the Portuguese language. Leany is the Secretary of State for Planning, Budget and Management in Brasilia. Then we have Swati Ramanathan, who we heard from yesterday, who is the co-founder of the Jana group. And then on the end, Geoff Mulgan, the Chief Executive of Nesta, the National Endowment for Science, Technology and the Arts here in the UK. So a very distinguished panel. We're going to hear from them in just a moment. But I always think it's good to start with you guys, because ultimately we're here to answer your questions. So before we get into the panel's views, I'd really like to hear from you. What does the delivery gap mean to you, and which questions did you particularly come to ask at this session? If there are anyone who wants to give us a stab, what does the delivery gap mean to you in your setting? Yes, please.
Hello. I've been waiting for the issue of gender to come up for the last day or so, and it hasn't. It could have come up in a session about justice, and it certainly should come up in a session about delivering services. Hundreds of millions of women on this planet are still disenfranchised for very basic reasons, such as they can't control their own reproduction. It costs very little money. And is it true, Calum, you just said, who sets and frames expectations? Is it true that's because expectations are set and framed by men?
Great, thank you. Other questions or delivery gap definitions that people want to explore during this conversation? Okay, well, that gives us a start. We'll certainly come back to that question, and please do be actively thinking about things you want to probe further with our panel as we go through. So, David, I wanted to turn to you first, if I may. I guess part of this, we need to, for governments to be able to respond to citizens, we need to understand better what it is that citizens are looking for and what their expectations are. And I wonder if you could kick us off with some thoughts about how we know what that is.
Sure, so thanks very much. I thought the introductory speech was terrific. And I'm delighted it went over. I just want to apologize in advance that the British rail system does not adjust. So I will be leaving, unfortunately, on time. But it was a truly inspiring discussion. Actually, just, you know, in McKinsey style, we sort of try to create a PowerPoint slide. And basically what it told me is that we actually don't know. The issue is actually very vexing and very broad for a variety of reasons. I mean, there's a very diverse set of issues when you look at this example, which is from Gallup, from national security, through to the economy, through to civil rights, unification, all sorts of themes. But there is this kind of big thing at the middle, which is called dissatisfied. People are just dissatisfied. I'm also a little bit vexed because yesterday I came in with quite a strong view, and then I listened to Kaushik from Tata talking about the fact that actually people in India are actually quite optimistic and quite excited about the future, and I was sitting there sort of morosely thinking about all the challenges and the dissatisfaction of many citizens who've expressed themselves recently in the various elections we've seen. But let me give you at least a couple of thoughts from what I see around the world. I think the first thing is that what the citizen and the customer actually are inextricably connected. And so what you've seen over the last 20 years is that customer experience has just changed so fundamentally and so dramatically for the average person who's engaging either in accessing content or accessing retail or accessing things, And essentially, when you look at the experience that people are having when they're actually engaging with government, it's still very similar. We talk a lot about digital, we talk about clouds, we talk about platforms and lakes and all kinds of things, but the experience that citizens are still having are very similar. And just to give you a couple of things, you know, what people are looking for is something that's personalized. The seamless omni-channel thing that I can start something while I'm on the train today, hopefully an application, and finish it when I get home. The real-time speed, this anywhere, anytime thing, and those are not experiences that governments have been able to provide. So the distance between what people are experiencing in their day-to-day lives as consumers and engagers of, let's call it, the business, private sector world, is actually, that gap is growing. The second observation, and I'll be, you know, I'm being provocative a little bit on purpose, is, you know, delivery matters. And here are some statistics from the US, which I thought were very interesting. And, you know, are they, you know, true of everywhere? No. But firstly, you know, customers that are satisfied with the State Department application process are 33% more likely to renew their passport. People who are satisfied with the Postal Service are 67% more satisfied with government than people who don't. 77% of satisfied customers trust their government, and 33% of experience is around the right support. So there is a very strong relationship between what people perceived as satisfied, dissatisfied, and their customer, let's call it, experience. The last thing I just want to talk about is actually two things. One is, I think there's this question about what is the servant mindset? What is the servant leadership that I don't hear a lot of dialogue around when I hear about the leadership characteristics of the public sector. Surprisingly, when you meet public sector officials, they're extremely committed. They spend enormous amounts of time working very hard. I can tell you many public sector officials I meet work harder than many private sector people that I know. But there is this question of what is the servant mindset. And I was reflecting on this a little bit in the previous talk. You know, there are these moments where it's just terribly anxious. I need to submit my tax return. I need to go through, I always say the people who are the most powerful are when you stop at that sort of border customs thing at passport. And you know, you're just waiting, whether you're in Saudi, the US, in the UK, you're just like waiting for the sort of terrible world to end. You want to get your visa. You're going through customs. You get stopped on the side of the road. How does one start to think about servant leadership and saying, what is the personal experience we're going to make that allows people to, one, understand what their rights are, to understand what it takes to get something done, to make sure that actually they can receive that service. And when they're not happy, they can actually say, I have a mechanism to engage. I'm not powerless, I can appeal. And so it's this thinking through that journey and thinking about servant leadership in the context of delivery that matters. And then lastly, and then I feel like I've said too much and I'm going to be stopped. We talked a little bit about it yesterday. I had the opportunity last night to spend a bit of time with my counterpart from South Africa, talking about integrity and governance. And I do think there is an integrity issue, and that we're not talking enough about what integrity means. And it's very, very difficult for citizens to look, you know, at these leaders that they're electing and then find out all these strange things in the newspaper the next day. Somebody recently once said to me, you know, I sort of look at them, I sit in a meeting with this individual, with this minister, but I know sort of what they did last night. It was a bit of an inference, maybe not a nice one, about, you know, what did they do last night? What is actually going on in the background? And how do we create much more transparency? And how do we begin this debate on integrity? Because you can deliver all those things, but in 1 minute you can really undermine that integrity. So that's a lot. That's not the most coherent, but at least hopefully some food for thought.
So, David, let me just pick up on one thing, and it was really with your starting point. You talked about citizen and consumers, and I understood you to be really saying the consumer experience is now well ahead of the citizen experience in terms of delivery. But one of the themes that came out yesterday, I think, was around co-creation and around engaging citizens and the public more generally in what it is government and politics are trying to do. So can you say a little bit more on your thoughts about, there's clearly a difference between a provider of services who in a digital age is able to get really rapid lifetime feedback on their services, but ultimately is motivated by the provision of those services, and a government which, if you like, is a collective providing for a society, where I think the relationship between the receipt of the service is different to the relationship when you're operating in the marketplace. So how far are those things directly analogous? How far should governments be thinking when they provide public services that these are consumables? And how far does the fact that these are societal goods change the way in which those should be created and designed?
So I'll probably say something which is going to get me into trouble, but that's common. So I have done a lot of work in the private sector, and I've done a lot of work in the public sector. And I sort of feel like we always try and look for the differences instead of the similarities. And when I look at, issues around education or health or, taxation or whatever, I mean, the analogies to things like, collecting taxes and collecting debts for a bank, education and health are distributed systems where you have to actually provide a really high quality service in a very disparate way. I'm not saying it's an easy problem, but I think that there actually are these parallels, and I think we look for the differences too often. Of course, there are things like areas like defense and intelligence where, I guess it gets very complicated to sort of think through what does that mean in terms of dissatisfied or satisfied citizens. But my personal view is that it's actually not those issues that are getting in the way of citizen dissatisfaction. It's the fact that when they wake up in the morning, they can't explain why their child is at a school which is not performing. Why, when they actually go to a health outlet, they're not getting the right advice in the right way and have to sit in long queues. Why, when they actually arrive or want to apply for a passport or get a birth certificate, do they need to take 2 days out of work? And I think that there's just a lot of, the term, it's a bad term, the low-hanging fruit, but it's these, let me call it service experiences, these moments of truth that are ultimately driving a huge part of this.
Okay. Let's go to the audience. Folks, questions on or comments on what we've heard so far from David on this? Please. Oh, microphone's just coming to you just now.
So, a 10-year-old fact is that only 7% of public expenditures are from a public agency to citizens in the United States. In other words, only 7% of the total dollars spent by the federal government are from a public agency providing a service to a client. What about the other 93%? Do you look at those as well when you talk about the delivery gap?
Thank you. Other questions? I saw a hand over here, please. If you could just introduce yourself, that'd be great. Thank you.
Yeah, my name's Michael Eaton. I run my own consultancy at the moment, but I spent 11 years as a UK senior civil servant doing policy, strategy and delivery. Is the comment about the, what does delivery mean? I did 23 years in the private sector, and you're very focused on how you perform, quarterly targets, what competitors are doing, and the choice of customer segment that you serve. Shifting into the public sector, the thing that became rapidly apparent was this question about you can do market segmentation, but you can't ignore any member of the market. But also, having worked most of my life in digital, the amount of public service delivery, which by definition requires human beings to be the delivery mechanism, is much greater. And no matter how much you attempt to do assisted digital or replaced by digital, in the end, it's much more about a coherent set of mechanisms for helping human beings to help other human beings in quite complex service delivery chains.
Great. Thank you very much. Yeah, one last comment here and then we'll...
From Tapestry Networks, there's an element of scale, David, it strikes me, that has been sort of left out of this. So For example, it is much, much easier digitally or by phone to deal with our local London council on all sorts of things than it is to deal with Uber if there's a problem. And you can actually call the council and they answer the phone. Uber, you can't even email. They've withdrawn email support, and when you finally get to them through their app, you meet either, I'm not sure if it's artificial intelligence or natural stupidity, but it's not good. And I think this element of size and scale, dealing with the local as a customer, is very different. And I think that factor of scale may be more powerful than whether it's public or whether it's private. I'm wondering about your thoughts on that.
Great. So, David, I'm going to give you just a couple of minutes to just respond to these because they're very much directed at you, and then we're going to join the rest of the panel.
Great. So clearly some difficult ones. The 7%, I think one also has to recognize that certainly in the US, a huge amount of money also flows through from the federal to the state to provide a lot of those services. But even then, when you look actually underneath the surface, and it was in that report, the productivity report, which looks at not only the the output and the spend, but it looks on a quality adjusted basis. There are some difficult debates that need to happen. If you look at the US, which is in that report, it's very clear that, the cost per, let's call it incremental life, has now reached a point which is way out of the realm of many other countries. Now what do you do about that? Do you start to say, well, if we've got the GDP, we should spend the extra dollar or not? It's hard to tell. I do think, though, when you look, and what was very interesting for us in that report, when you look underneath and you start to compare, for example, education, and you start to look at the quartiles of performance in education for the various players, you start to ask interesting questions like, really, why is the US so far behind country X like Greece? Now, there are lots of contextual issues, but I still think that underlying that there's a question of what is, let me call it, the outcome we're trying to achieve, and have we orchestrated and aligned ourselves in the most efficient way in order to deliver that outcome, despite the fact that we may have different objective functions. We may have different objective functions, we may want to create a different type of workforce, etc. But my honest belief underneath this is that still, at the end of the day, when you look at the quality adjusted outcomes, they are not, if I take the US, in the top quartile, given the amount of money we spend. So the question is why and how would we affect those outcomes? And I think taking that end-to-end view that you would see in a consumer environment matters. The segmentation you can't ignore, I think, is true, and a lot has to be done by a human. I mean, a good example is we can do all the analysis we want that there is going to be a particular business that's not going to comply with its tax in a northern English town, but somebody then has to get in a car and go and see that person and engage with them. I think it comes back, though, to this question of with what purpose and intent. Because, as I said, many of at least the people I meet in the public service joined the public service because it was a public service. They weren't there to make the extra dollar. They weren't there to kind of create the derivative that would make Brazilians for the company and buy them a big gold watch. They were there because they really connected with humanity. And last night at the dinner table that I sat at a dinner and with a couple of people, and it was amazing, just the sort of public service, let me call it, intention. But I still don't think that we've worked out how to unleash that spirit, and sorry, from a McKinsey person to say this, that spiritual energy into then how do we get people to actually engage with people on that public service view. The scale issue is an interesting thing, but 34% of what we do now in the world from an economic perspective is government. And every country I go to, and that was 8% 100 years ago. So I hear the question of scale, but I actually think there's sufficient scale. There's not a country that I've been to where there isn't sufficient scale from government. What I don't see in government, though, is sufficient ability to work across the various ministries in order to deliver the scale benefit. But I think that's more a culture and organization debate and a mission debate than I think that there is. I think there's sufficient scale. I just haven't yet seen how people work together to bring the scale to life. But as I said, I tread on thin ice regularly, so I'm looking forward to some support on my left.
Leany, do you want to come in?
Yeah, sure. I think, and I'll go directly to our examples in Brasilia. I think we have this problem of connecting to people and trying to legitimize and validate a set of policies that were a set of commitments when there was a campaign, right? So when someone is elected, you have these ongoing policies that are enormous, and you have a vision or something that you have offered, right? And the thing that's a challenge for all politicians is how to keep this conversation going for 4 years, because you have to do something and you have to feel that you are really representing, you're meeting your purpose. And in terms of how to get people connected, I think most countries or developed democracies, you have the townhouse meetings that were here yesterday, but many countries you don't have this kind of thing, right? It's just sending budget legislation to a Congress or to a local parliament and passing it. You don't have really a societal participation. So Brazil has two very good experiences that are the participatory budget, but they were captured by local leaders and interest groups. So they used to work well, but they're not working well anymore. So what we did in Brazil was trying to keep these good practices around the world. You have the town hall meeting, so we started that. And I think the most important thing is technology. Although you say, well, that it doesn't solve it all, but it added a lot of opportunities for people to interact. So you have the Facebook, you have Twitter, you have emails. Brasilia is highly connected in comparison to other cities in Brazil. But then you had 2 points. It's not only about what people ask. I think you have two big challenges. One is who you're talking to, because even if you expand with technology, still there are a lot of people who are out of the conversation. Even the virtual room, there are a lot of people who were not being listened. So when you say, well, we are doing what people say because there's this list of things that people have said, maybe you're not getting most of the population that's the most vulnerable, that are the poor women in the outskirts of the city. So you have to pay attention to who are your interlocutors. The second thing is what people talk about when they talk about policies, and that's one for those who love Robert Corbett. But people say, well, I want one thing, and sometimes you have to read that. It's just like interacting one-to-one. People say something and you have to, what is that? What do you mean by that? And that's very important for ranking priorities. So I'm going to give just 3 examples of this kind of delivery that that we've been doing there in terms of trying to meet people's needs, but at the same time rereading their demands. One thing is one policy, one type would be called type 1. It's I want it and I get it. So we had this huge demand for childhood care. And we did that exactly like that. We built schools, 20 schools, and we expanded the enrollment rates in private schools just by those lots that were not being used by the private schools. So 20,000 new kids from 0 to 5 years, and now 4 and 5 years, 100% of 4 and 5 years kids, they are in school in childhood care, and that's a gender policy. It's good for the kid. It's good. Most of the women in these vulnerable areas, they are single moms, and so that's very important for them for going to the labor market. A second type of policy that I think that it's possible, it's I want it and I get it differently. People sometimes ask for more hospitals and more doctors, but actually what they want is better health care or not being sick at all. So instead of building, we are actually building a child hospital, but we are putting most of our effort. That's we all know that they are limited. It's not only about financial resources, not because we're in a recession, but also state capacity and the human resources you have in the state to do that. So we try to reread that, and instead of building hospitals, putting money and efforts into primary and basic health care. So we have this program called Health in the Family. You have multidisciplinary professionals who go into the communities, and they do the primary care instead of just building hospitals. And the third type would be, I didn't ask, but I get it. And why is that? Because usually the demands are very short run. And incentives for the politicians is the short run, because you only have 4 years and you have to do that in 4 years. So do I need to build a water facility so that there's no water problem in 20 years? I'm not going to do that, right? So that's a very hard choice, but that's the kind of thing that you have to do. People don't ask, but you have to look at what's going to happen and make a combination of short-term and long-term policies. And in this case, what we did that was a water facility treatment and a landfill with all the technology, because it's such a shame that Brasilia, the capital of Brazil, the city with the highest income in the country, we've had the second largest open air landfill in the world. So tons and tons of open air trash. So we've built that because, it's the kind of thing that you have to balance. So the thing of having or not having people's approval, we feel that the general dissatisfaction, and yesterday in our afternoon we were talking about the communication and how hard it is to communicate. But still, you have ways to do that, to capture the debates. You have ways to do that. I think the most difficult part is how to make people know that you are trying hard to do that and doing the right thing. Because if you just look at what your main interlocutors are asking for, these are the interest groups, these are the organized groups, these are the organized people, the more educated people who want more, and it's legitimate. But if you just look at that, you're taking the wrong policies.
Thank you, Leany. So let me ask you about that. So you talked about the interlocutors who readily engage with you, the ones who come easily. And this may have a dimension of different excluded groups, whether that's women in some settings or other groups who are not normally represented. What have you been able to do to make sure that those voices are equally weighted in the kinds of conversations you've been having about priorities?
I think the townhouse meetings have been very useful because these were not done before. But during the campaign, the governor did that to sort of to build a program of his campaign. He went to all those different neighborhoods and what do you want? And actually, if you do some math, if you do some homework, you see that in the numbers too, because you see the demographics, you need the number of children who are enrolled, who are the neighborhoods that have and that don't have the health facilities, where there is water access and where it doesn't. Brasilia, just for the record, it's a rich city, the highest income, but the worst Gini index. So there's a lot of inequality. 15% of the population does not have access to sewage or water or the most basic infrastructure. So if you do, all the area studies, where you have to put some effort. The thing is, those people who live there, they are not in the internet. They don't use Facebook. Some do, but they don't use that for engaging with the government. So that's the kind of thing, the combination that I think you have to do. And I think for most parts of the world, it's because of inequality of access to this very basic service. And I'm not talking about these everyday services that are also very important for everyday life, but basically that's the kind of demand that you get for more educated people who have already access to the other services, right? So you have to do a combination of that. Improve some services using some technology, improving training people, human resources, putting different efforts, but also doing these other things that are kind of invisible for part of the population.
Great. Any questions from the floor? Does anyone want to ask anything particularly of Leany on this experience in Brasilia? We heard a little bit about participatory budgeting, and then a little bit more here about working with groups who might not otherwise be heard. Lady over here, please. If there's a microphone just coming to you.
The short-term incentives, I'm sorry, is it good? Oh, I'm Daniela Campelo. I'm from the Getúlio Vargas Foundation in Brazil. a political scientist. So the short-term incentives, we know, they're opposed for politicians to do visible things and things that people recognize. For the long-term ones, do we have to rely on the sense of purpose of the politicians, the good ones, or is there any way to create incentives for governments to think in the long term, even though maybe the electoral results are not going to come early on?
Good. Thank you very much. And another question over here. Thanks.
John Davis from the Foreign Office in the UK, struck by a connection possibly with the previous speaker about proximity. Do you find it easy, because I don't think we always find it easy to get our policymakers out to the sort of places that you're talking about and literally going to see and understand the problem? I wonder whether that's part of the solution, so that they get out of, as it were, the ministry or the town hall and actually go and see some of these things. Has that been part of it, or have you found ways to get civil servants, public servants, to understand the problem by being proximate?
Sorry, your question is about the civil servants or about the politicians?
Well, both. I think sometimes the politicians may be better because it's they have to do it. They do it more often. I don't think our public servants, sometimes they might want to, they find it difficult to, or sometimes almost aren't allowed to. But I wonder whether you found ways to get the public servants out to see the problem.
Yeah, actually, we started something that was never done in Brasilia, but it's very basic in terms of what its administrative tools. We did the planning, the strategic planning. We did all the the maps and everything. Here we have the chief of the project office, so we try to structure everything. But also take them, some of the civil servants there, in one of our very most vulnerable areas. It's one of the largest favelas in Brazil. It's larger than some in Rio, but they are horizontal. You don't have the mountains. Just they don't have any infrastructure. They do the weekly control meeting in the place with everyone, right? So that's very important, because then you have all the civil servants, all the project managers go into the place and seeing who they are serving. So that's something that's been very, very powerful in that sense. And also bringing this structure, I have in the planning a secretary. We created a department only for the monitoring of these policies, and then these people also go. We have created a network of we call it strategic assistance. So one person in every secretary and every state company. So we have this network of about 60 people, and all these people also go and they exchange their experiences, and they go to the places and experiment what are the policies that we are monitoring. They also know that. So it's very important to bring this, and I feel that people are very committed because they see what they are doing. Also, WhatsApp's been very helpful because you send pictures all the time, right? So when you inaugurate a school, you send in the WhatsApp and everybody knows that a school has been inaugurated. People feel important because they see what they're doing, because usually civil servants, especially those who are in the backstage, they don't feel important. They feel they work a lot, but they don't deliver. And that's very important. When I send to my people who work on the budget, I'll see what you've done, and then it's kind of appropriating the policy by people who are not that in the front end of the policy.
Thank you, Leany. Geoff, you in your time in the UK government and then now at Nesta have spent a lot of time thinking about innovations and about how to improve the quality of public services and delivery. Partly reflecting on what we've just been hearing about responsiveness and where engagement happens, I wonder if you could give us a few thoughts about promising avenues for improvement.
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously delivery is a wonderful thing, and not just because Amazon can get you a parcel in 1 hour. But I think one of the things we've learned in the last 20 or 30 years is that if you believe that it's enough for government to promise something and then achieve it, that then you'll get the love and gratitude of the people, you are at risk of disappointment. And I thought I might just sort of 3 reasons why that's the case, and slightly different avenues to pursue. So the first really relates to where you started this morning, Calum, which I think governments need to be fluent in prepositions, the meanings of these words, to, for, with, by, because they take you in very different directions. You want a government which can do things for people, regulate to keep the air clean, etc., and that's a particular style of delivery. You want them to be good at doing things to people, so you don't have to wait in queues, you can pay your taxes, get a passport without friction. That's all pretty essential and not unlike an Amazon or Uber. But that's very different from doing things with people. A lot of our work now, as many people in this room, is about transforming health services. So they've steadily shifted from doing things to people in hospitals to a model of healthcare with people, self-management, peer management, a whole range of things which shift the locus of health into the home and the workplace. And that's a very different spirit from the classic sort of delivery spirit. And picking up what Leany was saying, we're involved in quite a few democratic platforms in cities across Europe which are trying to shift more government to government by people. So they're taking some responsibility for budgets, for public spaces and things like that. Doesn't work well for setting monetary policy, but it's a very important part of this picture in making people feel it's a part of governance. The second bit is about trust. Quite a few years ago, I was asked by a Prime Minister to do a study on what had really been learnt about public agencies losing or gaining or regaining trust. And I think he expected the answer to be a delivery answer. Just make a promise, achieve it, and then you'll get trust. But that didn't really fit the history at all. And we actually redid this about 5 years ago. It was definitely important that public bodies did what they said they were meant to do. So if you're meant to cure people, cure them, to teach them, to fight wars, well, yeah, do that. But as important was how they responded to crises and whether in crises they could apologize in the right way, show they were learning, show they were listening. And most problems of trust came from mishandling acute moments of crisis and emotion, not from failure to deliver on the basics. And even more important than that was, in fact, the moral ethos and mission of the public service. The sense, going back to what you said, that there was something almost spiritual underlying the work of a police officer, a soldier, a teacher, or a doctor. And often it was felt the public services had lost that, and then even if they were competent, they wouldn't in fact be trusted and wouldn't be legitimate. So I think that it's really important to get back the moral element into this. This is not a purely technocratic question. And finally, going to actually the question on gender, governments tend to try and measure how well they're doing. They have all sorts of metrics to try and confirm to themselves how wonderfully they're doing in building roads, creating jobs, whatever it may be. And that is essential. But I think every now and again it's good to flip the sort of telescope around and look in a much more open way at what really is mattering to citizens, what's the pressure points in their lives. I've twice done this from within a government, and both times, gender came out really starkly, that there were large swathes, mainly of lower income women, who were getting almost nothing from government and weren't taking part in any of the sort of consultation processes, weren't being measured. And I think that sort of deep listening is, again, an antidote to the slightly circular loop of setting targets, persuading yourselves you're meeting them, when actually life is happening somewhere elsewhere. So, yep, delivery, fantastic. Let's be like Amazon, get results within an hour. Fantastic. But if you only do that, you're missing a very large part of the true life of democracy and government.
Thank you, Geoff. Really provocative. So maybe just to pursue one thought there and your element on trust. Both you and David have now spoken about moral purpose and, if you like, the spiritual side of public service. And it's a theme that we'll explore a bit further in one of the deep dives. But Geoff, I just wondered if you would comment a little bit on in a way, the challenge I put to David about consumers versus citizens, and how that sits, even that language sits alongside the sense of a public service and the distinction between being a public service and a commercial service. How does that play out in the context of trust, and what can leaders in the public service do to reinvigorate, to enable that spirituality and deep moral purpose that you both talked about?
Yeah, well, if you are delivering passports, I agree with David, that's not that different from delivering a parcel. And you can do that efficiently or inefficiently, or waste people's time or not. But if you're running a school, that's something very different. And there it's important the teachers do have a deep sense of service, which goes beyond a customer service to a moral purpose. And I actually think the healthiest schools are also ones where the public are co-creators. And a lot of our work at the moment in England is on helping scale up models of really citizen involvement in volunteering in schools, hospitals, criminal justice. So a significant proportion of the population are helping as mentors or coaches, contributing to really the production system of public services. Now, they're never going to do that for Amazon or Tesco, and it'd be weird if they did. But that is actually a way of not only getting better value into the public service, I think it also improves its accountability. If, let's say, a hospital, and in some hospitals we've got 2,000, 3,000 volunteers each week going into the hospital to do the things that doctors and nurses don't have time to do, that definitely improves the experience of the patient, but it also makes it much more likely the hospital will act with a spirit of accountability than if accountability is only done in a technocratic way through filling in forms of measurement.
Thank you. No, I'm going to take a question from over here first, actually. Yes, Tilly at the back there.
Thank you. Thank you to all of you for such incredible accounts and insightful thoughts. My question is to David Fine regarding what you said about the parallels between government and civil society. Well, between government and private sector. In the private sector, if you're planning a service, you do a market survey and you disaggregate the market according to LSM, geography, etc. Do you think that the same approach is used adequately by government? I'm asking because when it comes to social justice or inequality, some of the decisions that are made by government exacerbate inequality unintentionally. They exclude the poor and they exclude people geographically. And my project right now at Harvard is to create a social impact instrument that is going to help policymakers to predetermine the social justice impact of their plans, their policies, or a law. And I would like to know if that's something that is needed. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll take a couple more for me. Any other questions? Gentleman at the back there. Thank you. Yep.
Hello, my name's Jason Doherty. I'm a local government officer of some 25 years experience. I just want to talk about Grenfell House for a minute. We have a crisis of the first order that's thrown up issues around regulation, about responsiveness, and around retrenchment with an alienated set of residents. And it seems to me that we were talking about humility yesterday a little. And here we have a failure in the public sector of the first order. And personally, I feel ashamed that this has happened in this country, one of the richest in the world, and we don't seem to be taking it with the degree of seriousness that it might demand. And I'm not talking about the seriousness of the catastrophe, but addressing perhaps some of the underlying imperatives that have led up to this, particularly retrenchment, an antipathy towards regulation. This is a fundamental failure of government.
Thank you. Geoff, can I come to you on those couple of questions?
Well, I think for those of you who aren't in Britain, Grenfell House is probably the biggest sort of event of governance I can remember for decades. I think it will be a turning point on a whole series of fronts for the reasons you've said, and is already, I think, leading to a complete sort of shift of direction on exactly the issues as said about regulation, about spending, about listening to parts of the population. So in a way I disagree with you, because I think it is actually leading to a really society-wide debate, which hasn't happened in living memory, but will be probably missing to most people in this room because you're not living in this society. And on Sunday night, there was actually a big fire around the corner from my house. I live in an area not unlike Grenfell, very, very mixed, and it was being squatted in fact, by refugees. And the conversation, as the community gathered, slightly sort of in the weird way we do, watching fires, luckily no one was hurt. And with the fire service, who, as in that case, responded amazingly and absolutely embodied that moral sense of service, I really felt, something had shifted in the last week in a big way, which won't go backwards. But, so that's a slightly parochial conversation maybe for this audience.
There was a question from Julie there.
So first of all, I liked the description you used, you know, the prepositions, the by, from. I think that's the concept of segmentation, how we think about segmentation of problems. I think each problem requires a different way of engaging with, let's call it, the citizens. And I think it does depend on the nature of the service we're trying to provide, and I thought that was actually very helpful. But I do think there is this issue of how does one apply some of these principles. And I'll give you two examples. I think the first example is McKinsey has, as part of what we call the McKinsey Social Initiative, we've been doing this project on called Generations, which looks to try and actually very quickly help create employment. It's been done in Kenya, in the US, in Spain, in Mexico, and in India. Very quickly, there was an article recently to help people find work, train them for work. What's interesting about that is actually a lot of the underlying thinking is based on classic segmentation. Is this a person who actually has a mindset? They want to get up in the morning and actually just arrive at, let me call it, the training on time. There are certain psychometric ways in which you can actually see whether this is an individual who wants to lie at home or this is a person who actually wants to seek work. And a variety of other, let me call it, mechanisms for doing segmentation, which I think start to give you a sense of the population that you can actually effectively empower, and some of the population you can't. It's just, or may require very different interventions. A similar thing, I think, recently, and maybe in one of your breaks you can talk to Frank around the refugee issue in Germany and how to think about how do you bring people in, recognizing you suddenly have a flood of people, and in a very structured way, think about what's the mechanism by which you can actually house those people, provide them with some sort. I'm not saying everything's perfect, by the way, in that process, but how can you actually bring some of these operational metrics and segmentation mechanisms to what's the kind of person I have in front of me here? How do they actually fit? What kind of profile? How do I triage that? Just like a hospital would triage, which is no different to a segmentation. And then how do I process that person? So I'm not trying to say that, therefore, segmentation is a solution, because on some of the issues that you've raised, like social justice, you know, where people have been put in very, very, very difficult situations, you know, it's hard. But I still think that at least by passing the problem, I think one can find different solutions. And I do think there is a tendency to say, well, just because, you know, education, I was walking back with some people from this dinner last night, you know, we're just going to kind of force the education system, everyone's going to comply with this system here today. You know, that's not the solution. We know that. We know that different solutions require, different problems require different solutions. And so I do think there's a lot we can learn about how to nuance and understand these differences and then orchestrate ourselves accordingly. But I hope that it sounded, when I finished, a bit vague and conceptual, so apology. I'm happy to. And I do have to watch the British rail system, so if you don't mind.
So I'm on your behalf going to give David a free pass to slip out at whichever point he needs to. But let me... Thank you, David.
Good luck.
Great. Swati, so just as we talk about segmentation there, I guess there's a sort of classic trigger maybe that goes off in one's mind about the marketeer sitting with a great sort of dashboard in front of them, which is very much the deliverer model. But what's critical there is also the information from the citizen, in this case, or the consumer. A lot of your work is focused on how citizens themselves can get together and can really shape and influence and drive significant change in public services. And I wonder if you could say a little bit from that perspective about how you see the role of citizens as active and engaged participants, and then correspondingly how government should make itself more responsive and able to listen to the views of collective citizens.
So I'm actually glad, Calum, because I think that you left me to the end with some strategy, because I think that the experiences of India are so different from the developed, where we are today is very different from where the developed nations are. And so we are a country which is only 32% urban. We are so rural, and we've continued our urban march. I think that certainly the puck is going towards urbanization, and so our greatest challenges are going to be about delivery of a decent, basic quality of life to all of India's citizens. I think we're also a diverse and multicultural, multiple political constituency, the citizens there. And I think it's for the first time after urbanization that citizens are demanding more than just access to their government leaders. They're demanding development. And so that's something new, and urbanization has triggered that. And politicians are realizing that urban is a lot more complex than rural, just in terms of the systems of delivery that are required. I talked a little bit yesterday about being not just a deep state in that we are opaque and unanswerable about the decision-making that government makes, but we're also a deeply incompetent state. And that's still, that is the crux of it. I think that we haven't had the time to develop our systems, our institutions, our technical capacities. And so if you look at the pyramid of government delivery, it's got a very wide base and a very small. So you have a steel frame of India, which is all the bureaucracy, which is a very small number. And then below it is the largesse of giving public positions to people who don't necessarily, deserve it in terms of competence. So we use positions in government as more as a benefit than as actually a delivery of high quality infrastructure and services. I think also that therefore our issues are very different from yours. You have citizens who you need to engage in things like Brexit, you have the refugees, you have the migrants, you have healthcare and social services running out of money. Ours are very much around development, primarily. So if you look to engage citizens, it's about development. I think, though, that in our experience, I think here lies the great opportunity, in that things are so bad that democracy, which in India is really more about electoral democracy rather than the democracy of between elections, the engagement of citizens with their governments between elections. And I think this is where the failure of services provides an opportunity, because I think if we were like a Singapore or, if we had great services, then we were less likely to engage. And really, the plumbing of participation and of democratic engagement and deepening of democracy, we wouldn't have had a chance. I think in a country of 1.2 billion, 300 million of which are in our cities, and going the next 20 years, we're supposed to be 500 million. I think it's important that the how of it is equally important as the outcome. And I think that this is where engagement, forcible engagement of citizens is actually a good thing that will happen if we do it right. So if I look at the entire gaps in government delivery and where citizens can engage, then you have the upstream gap of completely, arcane or inadequate policies, laws, etc., which needs a lot of help, whether they're environment or jobs or land laws or heritage protection. All of these require a revamping of it. And you have the more midstream problem of new infrastructure requirements or rebuilding of existing infrastructure to provide for modernizing a country. And there, I think that the Western classical method of delivery will not work in India, simply because we have not built that kind of capacity in our systems. And we will have to find new forms of delivery, but which are governed, the regulatory aspects of it, which need to be robust. Contractual competence in government will need to increase. And then the downstream, which is of the immediate stuff, the real pains, which are quick fixes, garbage not getting picked up, road pothole in a road, street light not working, etc. And here, I think, is where you actually can clean up. And here, the new mechanisms, what I was calling the new public utilities of social networks, I think these are easy ways to get people to build the muscles of participation, the muscles of democratic engagement and of negotiation, of prioritization. I think this is where we come in. I want to end by giving you an example in India. Over the last 10 years, and actually it's now in 2011, we introduced a website called I Change My City. And ultimately, participation, we realized over all of the work that we did on the ground with, organizing communities and mobilizing citizens, we realized that nobody cares if you start talking about, romantic ideals of democracy. It's the nuts and bolts. It's the nuts and bolts of democracy which are the most important. It's the nuts and bolts of participation. And that can only happen when it is hyperlocal. It is not just around my city, it's not even my neighborhood, it's right outside my home. And the pain that I feel on garbage not being cleared or my child falling on the footpath, etc. So what we've built is I Change My City, which is hyperlocal. And it's amazing because when we started, we ended up, the outcome that we wanted was grievance redressal, but also community building. To say when you have a diverse income and diverse cultural neighborhood, the one thing that can bind you is improvement of your neighborhoods. And that's, it doesn't matter. We all care about it, right? So it was these two that we had in mind. And the grievance redressal part of it has really shot up. I mean, just to give you some statistics, we have about 1.7 million people who have registered on our website. And we started with Bangalore, and now we are in about 600 cities. And you have the full bit. So it's a C to G platform. It's a C to many Gs. So originally, when you have government, they say, I'm the water supply, and I want the citizens to come and engage with me on the problems that you have on water supply, and somebody on power, and somebody on garbage. It's too tedious, and it's too difficult for citizens. So this, I Change My City, provides a platform which is a 1C to many Gs. And therefore, I come there and I can immediately get to know, to put my problem on that. And we distribute it with a backhand shake with all of the various agencies. And the resolution is amazing. We have about 70% resolution on that platform. And we now have, 10 months ago, there was a Clean Bharat. It's called Swachh Bharat Initiative, which was initiated by the Ministry of Urban Development under the diktat of the Prime Minister. And they engaged with us and they wanted us to run that. And we have about 1 million people, 1 million registrations on complaints of this, and 95% clearance. And now that is very important. Why? Because people really are cynical about government. I mean, as with everywhere else, in India too, nobody really believes anything will ever happen. But something like this begins to have, overcome that trust deficit. To say, hey, if I report on something, it actually does happen. So I think this public utility is quite a phenomenal way by which you start building the muscles of participation in things that matter to me the most, and then hopefully involve them in greater aspects of policy and infrastructure priorities and things like that.
Thank you very much. One question for you all, really. You've all spoken in different ways about the challenge of engagement. You've just given us a great example of that, Swati. And Leany, you talked about it in terms of town halls, and Geoff, you've been talking about more flat structures of democratic engagement. But there are barriers there, obviously, and one of the questions we've given at the start related to gender equality, but we've also focused on other excluded groups. How far can each of these mechanisms that you've each talked about go? And where are the limitations of that? And if we start from the perspective that one of the challenges of the public service, as David was saying at the beginning, is generally to be universal and not only to respond to those who make their voice heard, how can each of the examples that you gave be made to go that bit further to reach some of the disadvantaged or unexcluded groups? Leany?
Well, I think that's the challenge not only for local governments, but for any government in any part of the world, right? To get the right thing done and how you get to hear those who are outside of the conversation. And it's true for the UK or the US or Brazil or India. So the answer is, I don't know. I mean, I love to have your engagement and maybe provide us some insights on how to do that, because that's really, really hard. I mean, you try to do that and you hire McKinsey to do that for you, you know, what people want, and go there and you do that yourself and you put people doing that. But it's really hard. And I think, I love what Geoff said, that although I think that delivery is really, really important, that's one of the reasons why we elect people, right? It's to make things happen and happen differently. And answering to Daniela's question, if this is one moment, when do you do that? I mean, to look at the long run. I think elections is the starting point. Of course, it's very little, but when you elect someone, you elect for a vision. So if you voted for Hillary or Trump, you're voting for a vision, right? So that's a foundation, let's say. What happens after then depends on many variables that are economic or social or of all kinds. So it's really difficult to do that. And as I've said, in Brasilia, what we did was looking at the map and looking at the numbers and how demographics and all the social indicators, and well, let's do this. And people are not asking for it, but eventually it's going to be a short-term problem, right? If you don't do the primary care, the emergency rooms are already filled up. So you have to do something about that. Or about the water facility. It's very funny because we started that it was a long-term problem. It was 2.5 years ago. But this year we have the most extreme drought in 50 years. So now we are rationing water in Brasilia. Next year, if you hadn't started doing this, next year there will be 3 days of rationing in Brasilia. And because of the plant, now next year there will be no problem. And for the next 30 years, we will have a good water provision. So this is the kind of thing that you do, but it's really hard because usually people who are outside.
Thank you for taking on board the point about humility and saying when we don't have the answers. Geoff, have you got answers?
Well, just commenting on the technology side of this. So we've been developing these sort of software tools for cities and parliaments, which allow people to participate. Obviously, and they're in use in about 15 cities now. Their great weakness is that on their own, those will only be used by the relatively educated, affluent, male, etc., etc. So a huge amount of effort has gone into countering that tendency of all past digital democracy experiments. Probably 3 best examples are 2 in Spain, Barcelona and Madrid, partly driven by mayors who came to power from a community activist background and have ensured that the online stuff is always complemented with offline community meetings. And they have roughly achieved participation rates which are high and reflect the gender, age, socioeconomic background of the population, which I think is unique in the world. The other really good example is Reykjavik in Iceland, which has had a series of tools really for quite a long time now. And exactly as you said, they're mainly focused on very local sort of public space issues. But again, their usage levels pretty much are everyone in the population. I'm afraid there's no examples here in the UK I can cite yet. But say all the best examples, and we published a global survey of these a few months ago, if you're interested, are ones where the online and offline are used to complement each other, to ensure genuine engagement on the things which matter to people, and where, this is a crucial thing, the design of the engagement means that people's views change as they engage. And I think this is a huge difference from just doing surveys or referendums, which we've had our own issues with, where the tools are just ways of expressing a view. I think what democracy is searching for is processes which help you understand better the people who disagree with you, help you understand better the trade-offs as you participate. And I think we're now getting much more mature methods which do that. Just a final comment on India. India is a very complex, paradoxical place, but one of the things India has achieved in the last 3 or 4 years is the most important public innovation of recent decades anywhere, and the most inclusive one, I think, through Aadhaar UID, which is used mainly for distributing money, financial services. But it would be interesting to ask if that was really used as a platform for transforming democracy in India, what might happen? Because you now have a tool no other country on earth has, brilliantly executed in a delivery way, using many private sector ideas. But I think the really interesting question is how you flip that as a tool both for welfare and for democracy. But, anyway.
It was initiated as a welfare tool, but it has now become, it has inundated all aspects. I think it's an important question that you ask, and I think that there are many areas of that we actually battle with. We have issues of literacy. We have issues of multilingual sort of citizenry. We have issues of access. I think these are the three most important ones. But I think that India is an unusual sort of a country. I think that the constituency that is kind of left out in our engagement with government is, in fact, the middle class. In fact, you will find, where in the UK and the US, it was the middle class which was the vanguard of building institutional accountability, of building institutional abilities. And then, with incremental suffrage, many others also were allowed to get into the process of electoral sort of equality. In India, because we had instant universal suffrage, strangely, it was the middle class that got left out. And so very often, you'll find people at the slightest engagement of the middle class raising their voices. It's a derogatory term to say, oh, it's middle class involvement, elite middle class sort of thing. But I think that the middle class getting engaged now is not necessarily something that is bad in terms of the institutional robustness, because you do need somebody who has the convening power, who has the ability to kind of ensure accountability and ensure delivery, to lead the vanguard of this kind of an upgradation. And ultimately, if it improves the quality of life for everybody, which is the most important thing, then you're okay. And if it improves transparency, accountability, participation for all, then you're okay. And that's what you kind of aim for. And I think we can't have an approach of all or nothing. It's either 1.2 billion people engage or nobody else, because it does make sense. If you improve a road and it's 10 people who have been involved in improving that road, well, the whole city is going to use that road. So to that extent, you're actually okay. If you ensure that corruption is rooted out, then it benefits everybody. So, but yes, I think that the largest amounts of voices and inclusive platforms are the most important. And hopefully NGOs will make sure that nobody gets left out.
Thank you very much indeed. So I'm afraid we've come to an end of this session. I just wanted to briefly pull out 4 themes that I think were really current here and which lead us on to the next breakout sessions we're going to have. So I think, first of all, we clearly identified the difference in public services as compared to more commercially available services. An interesting discussion about how those are rooted in a sense of value and purpose that animates the public service. And then also the universal dimension of so many public services. The government doesn't have the option to leave certain people behind. It needs to deliver for everybody. And that makes it a different type of challenge to a more commercial provider who can segment the market and elect not to provide for certain people. We then had a good discussion about being clear on what it is we're delivering. The fact that some services are very different. There are certain things the government does provide which do look more like commoditized services, but there are a large number of services provided by government which are delivered to people as individuals and often delivered by other individuals, and that makes the whole business of what's being delivered very important. But Geoff's point about being clear on the prepositions as well, I think, is very important. Being really clear on the different types of services that government is seeking to deliver and being strategic about the ways in which that can be done could be a very important way of engaging better with people. Engagement, I thought, was our third theme. A lot on hyper-local and how much easier it is to engage with citizens when we're dealing with the issues that confront people day in, day out. But I think we're also all challenged by Leany's very honest answer that it's really, really hard to ensure that you're properly engaging with all citizens and to make sure that their voices are represented. And I think the example that was given of the recent tragedy in the UK in Grenfell Tower, I think is a challenge for everybody who's a policymaker in the UK, but is a metaphor for people elsewhere about excluded communities and about how those who don't have a voice or don't have power within an ordinary system have the opportunity to be heard in any kind of conversation about the delivery of public services. And then I think, lastly, and very closely related to that, a question about trust. And I thought that this discussion about where does trust come from, and the fact that it doesn't only come from delivery, that just giving people what they want isn't the only way of doing it. I love Leany's kind of distinction of the different ways in which the government of Brasilia is responding to people's needs. And then the articulation of the fact that actually it's not just what is delivered, but it's how it's delivered. And that brought us back full circle to the engagement of citizens. If citizens and people are fully engaged, not only in how the challenges are framed and the service delivery is designed, but also in aspects of the delivery, then we get to a much richer model. So plenty to chew on from this discussion. We're going to go now to a coffee break in just a moment, but then there will be two deep dive sessions. One group will be looking very much at this question of values and at the role of public servants in the delivery of public services. And then the other group was going to be looking at how we can support governments in listening better, in being more innovative, in being more willing to show humility and admit when failure has taken place. So they'll be taking place, as before, in the seminar rooms through to the rear. I just wanted to also highlight that at 12:40, after those sessions, we're going to be having the opportunity here to hear a little bit more about the challenge of refugees, and particularly the challenge in Germany. So we have something of a case study, an opportunity to hear from Frank Matten from McKinsey about the work that he's been doing with the German government thinking about these issues. And so it'll be a really fascinating chance to hear more about that, and I hope you will all join us back here at 12:40. So in a moment, I'll let you go for coffee, 15 minutes for coffee, and then to the seminar rooms afterwards. But before doing so, we've had a really rich discussion. I want to thank you for contributing to that through questions, and ask you to join me in thanking our panel.